If you are listening to this while driving down an interstate or maybe you're just walking down a city sidewalk, I want you to think about the asphalt and the concrete right under your feet.
Yeah, we really don't think about it much, do we?
No, we don't. Usually when we think about a city's infrastructure, we just, we think of it as this fixed anchor.
Right, like it's completely static.
Exactly. You pour the foundation, you lay the pavement, you build the high-rises, and it is permanently set in stone. Literally.
It feels incredibly static.
Yeah.
I mean, we basically treat our built environment like it is the final draft of the landscape,
Yeah.
Unmovable,
Yeah.
permanent.
But then you start looking at the global data on urban flooding over the last few decades, and suddenly that permanent concrete anchor starts looking a lot less like a rock.
Oh, absolutely. It looks a lot more like a massive, incredibly heavy sponge sitting on top of a waterbed.
And it's a waterbed that we are actively draining from the inside, right?
Yeah.
While simultaneously pouring just millions of gallons of water on top of it.
Yeah, what we have built is, well, it's the absolute definition of an engineered collision course between static infrastructure and highly dynamic nature.
And that engineered collision course is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are so thrilled you're here with us.
Really have a lot to cover.
We do. Our mission today is a massive one. We are going to explore the mind-bending geological, engineering, and political reasons why our modern cities just keep flooding.
And maybe more crucially, we're going to look at why simply, pouring more concrete or building a slightly higher wall won't actually save us anymore.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really see the whole board here, you can't just look at the rain, can you?
No, what's fascinating here is that you really have to look at the dirt beneath our feet, the specific physics of the pavement we drive on, and the economic incentives written into our local laws.
Exactly. And to do that, we've been pulling apart an incredibly dense stack of research for you.
A really diverse stack, yeah.
Yeah, we've been looking at global satellite measurements of land subsidence, these incredibly complex hydrological regression studies on urban basins from the USGS, and deep dive policy papers on federal flood insurance.
Not to mention looking back at the geographical history of ancient Mesopotamia from Geographical Magazine.
Right. And what is so wild is that when you put all of these completely disparate fields of study on the same table, they all point to one underlying, almost tragic irony.
Which is that the very geological characteristics that made these specific locations perfect for human settlement in the first place are the exact same characteristics that guarantee they are going to flood.
The irony is just staggering. The reason the city is there is the literal reason the city is drowning.
And all of our brilliant modern engineering isn't fixing it. In a lot of cases, it's accidentally speeding up the clock.
So to really understand how we got here, I think we have to start at the very beginning.
The historical context, yeah.
Right. Like, why on earth did humanity look at a floodplain, a piece of land literally defined by the fact that it floods, and decide, yes, let's build our most important permanent structures right here?
It's a great question, because if you look at the geographical analyses of early human civilization, the pattern is entirely undeniable.
It's everywhere.
It is. The greatest early societies didn't just happen to settle near water. I mean, their entire existence was predicated on the dynamic behavior of rivers.
Like Mesopotamia.
Exactly. Think about Mesopotamia. The name itself translates to between rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates.
And you have ancient Egypt entirely reliant on the Nile.
Right, and China's earliest dynasties blossoming in the valley of the Yellow River.
And, we learn in grade school that they needed the water for drinking and basic agriculture, but it's so much more mechanical than that.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just that the water was there.
Yeah.
It's specifically what the water did when it overflowed.
Because for our ancestors, flooding wasn't a catastrophe.
No, not at all. It was the engine of their economy. Rivers are incredibly dynamic forces of geology.
They're like a giant saw, right?
That's a good way to put it. As a river flows and meanders over thousands of years, it erodes the earth and carves out these massive, wide, flat valleys on either side of its banks.
And as it's doing that carving upstream, it's picking up millions of tons of material.
Right. It's carrying suspended sediment, clay, silt, sand, and incredibly rich organic matter.
And here's where the flood becomes vital.
Exactly. When the seasonal rains or the monsoons hit, the river naturally bursts its banks. But it doesn't just spill water.
It spills all that material.
Yeah, as the water spreads out over that wide, flat valley, it slows down. And, well, when water slows down, it drops whatever it's carrying.
like the Yellow River, which literally gets its name from the massive amounts of yellowish-brown loess, a silt that it carries down from the highlands.
Exactly right. So every single year, the river overflows and deposits a fresh layer of this nutrient-rich sediment.
Free fertilizer.
Basically, it was essentially a massive, free, automated delivery of high-quality fertilizer spread perfectly across a flat, easy-to-farm valley.
So from an agricultural standpoint, the floodplain was the absolute best real estate on the planet.
By far. And because it was so flat, it was easy to build roads and settlements, and, the slow-moving river provided a built-in highway for trade.
Which makes it's like we stumbled upon this beautiful, dry riverbed, notice how perfectly flat it was, and decided it was the ideal place to pour a massive concrete foundation for a permanent campsite.
Right.
And then a few months later, we act completely shocked and outraged when the rainy season hits and our pens are underwater. We totally forgot why the ground was so perfectly flat to begin with.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. We essentially traded the agricultural benefits of the floodplain for industrial and commercial benefits.
But we kept the flood risk.
Exactly. And to justify that trade, we had to adopt this pervasive, arrogant myth that we could permanently tame the ecosystem.
The Popular Science article talked about this, right? The idea of a natural disaster.
Yes. The concept that there is no such thing as a quote-unquote natural disaster.
Because rain and storm surges are just weather.
Right. They're just natural occurrences. They only become disasters when they collide with human-made environments that demand dominance over nature. We stopped viewing floods as natural, cyclical events and started viewing them as adversaries to be defeated.
There's this quote I found looking into the history of U.S. infrastructure from Harold X., who was the Interior Secretary in the 1930s.
Oh, at the Hoover Dam dedication.
Yes. He was speaking at the dedication of the Hoover Dam, and he actually boasted about man's conquest of nature. That was the literal phrasing.
Conquest of nature.
Yeah. That was the foundational mindset of 20th century urban planning.
And it was a mindset that really infected every aspect of environmental management. I mean, we suppressed natural wildfires in the American West because they were inconvenient.
Which just led to massive, catastrophic fuel buildup.
Exactly. We tapped rivers to build sprawling golf course cities in the middle of the desert without planning for decadal droughts.
Right.
And of course, we built massive metropolitan hubs directly on top of floodplains, utterly convinced that we could just engineer the water away with enough concrete and steel.
Which leads us perfectly into the physics of what is actually happening on the ground today. Let's talk about the surface crisis.
Okay, let's get into the hydrology.
Because we built our cities in these natural goals to take advantage of that fertile, spongy soil, but then in our quest for this conquest of nature, we decided to pave over that exact same soil.
We sealed it up.
Yeah. So if you are a hydrologist looking at a modern city, how does that surface actually change the physical behavior of the water?
This is where the mechanics get incredibly fascinating. There is a landmark USGS study on estimating flood magnitudes in urban basins in Missouri that breaks this down beautifully.
The Missouri Stream Gauge Study.
Yes. The fundamental takeaway from the hydrology data is that urban floods and rural floods are two completely different physical phenomena. You absolutely cannot use the same mathematical models to predict them.
Because in a natural rural basin, the ground is basically a giant, complex sponge.
Exactly. You have forests, deep-rooted agricultural land, natural meandering channels.
So the water has places to go.
Right. When a heavy rainstorm hits a natural rural basin, the water infiltrates the soil. It permeates down into the groundwater. It gets absorbed by plant roots.
It takes its time.
Yeah, the water takes its time making its way over the land and into the streams. But when you urbanize a basin, you radically alter the surface geology. You introduce what hydrologists term impervious area.
Right, which means streets, multi-lane highways, sprawling parking lots, and just thousands of acres of rooftop.
Exactly. You've taken the natural sponge and vacuum sealed it under perfectly smooth, uniform tarmac.
So when the rain hits that tarmac, it has absolutely nowhere to soak in.
The infiltration rate drops to zero, and this drastically alters a critical metric called basin response time.
Because the water can't sink, it instantly becomes surface runoff.
It hits the pavement and immediately shoots into the gutters, down the storm drains, and into the concrete channels.
Which just accelerates everything.
Exactly. This causes the peak flow, which is the maximum volume of water rushing through a channel at any given second, to spike much, much faster. And it reaches a significantly higher volume than it ever could in a natural setting.
And the USGS researchers actually mapped this out using regression equations, right? They were trying to build a mathematical model to predict these massive spikes in flow.
Yes, they analyzed historical data from 35 different stream gauges in Missouri.
And stream gauges are essentially scientific instruments stationed in rivers and streams that continuously measure water levels and flow velocity.
Right. And when they ran the regression equations, they found that out of all the possible variables, two were overwhelmingly statistically significant in predicting the magnitude of an urban flood.
Okay, what were the two variables?
The total drainage area, meaning the square mileage of land funneling water to that specific point, and the percent impervious area.
And when I was reading through their methodology, there was this one detail that I found absolutely wild.
The land cover dataset adjustment.
Yes. To calculate that percent impervious area, the researchers used a digital mapping tool called the 2001 National Land Cover Dataset.
Right. Satellite imagery, basically.
But when they started running the math against the historical flood records, the math kept breaking.
It didn't line up.
Because urbanization was happening so incredibly fast in these Missouri basins that the 2001 satellite data was actually too paved to accurately reflect the historical reality.
It's an incredible piece of scientific detective work. The hydrologists realized that the historical stream flow data from the 70s, 80s, and 90s was recorded when the basin still had a decent amount of green space.
Right.
But by 2001, developers had poured so much concrete that the satellite map didn't match the historical reality.
So what did they do?
Well, for 8 of those 35 stream gauges, the scientists literally had to manually adjust the impervious area data downward.
By how much?
In some extreme cases, by up to 23%, just so their mathematical models would work and reflect the true historical conditions.
It's just staggering to think about. We've fundamentally altered the hydrological mechanics of hundreds of square miles of Earth in just a few decades.
And we didn't update our engineering math to keep up.
Exactly. But, okay, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Because I think a lot of people might look at this and say, all right, we paved the sponge, that was a mistake. But we are the species that built the Panama Canal. We put rovers on Mars.
Right, the engineering mindset.
Yeah, why can't we just engineer our way out of this? Why can't we just build massive storm drains, install bigger pipes, and brute force the water out of the city with giant pumps?
Well, that is the exact instinct that drove urban planning for the last century. But the reality is, we are hitting a hard physical limit on our ability to out-engineer the sky.
What do you mean by a physical limit?
The core of the problem is a shift in the type of flooding we are experiencing. Historically, we worried about fluvial flooding, which is when a river slowly swells and overtops its banks.
Like the classic Mississippi River flooding.
Right. But what is destroying cities today is pluvial flooding.
Okay, pluvial flooding. That's when the sheer volume and intensity of a localized rainfall event completely overwhelms the drainage capacity of the city, regardless of what the river is doing.
Exactly. The water just hits the pavement and instantly backs up.
So why not bigger pipes?
Because the mathematical formulas and climate models that engineers used 40 or 50 years ago to size those pipes and pumps are now entirely obsolete. The atmosphere is warming, which means it holds more moisture.
So rain's harder.
Much harder. We are seeing storm bursts that are simply breaking the historical models. The math they used back then just no longer applies.
You can actually see this engineering failure happening in real time. Like, look at New York City during Tropical Storm Elsa a few years ago.
Oh, that was a perfect example.
The storm dropped about 3 inches of rain. Historically, 3 inches of rain is a wet Tuesday.
It's nothing.
It shouldn't be a catastrophic event, but it fell with such violent intensity in such a short window of time that the water hit the concrete and instantly overwhelmed the subway grates.
And New York has a massive, sophisticated system of subterranean pumps designed to run 24 hours a day to keep the subways dry.
But the sheer gallons per minute flow rate overwhelmed the intake vents.
Right. The pumps couldn't physically move the water fast enough, and the stations literally turned into waterfalls.
Or look at Detroit.
The highway flooding?
Yes. Yeah. They have this massive sunken interstate system. These highways were intentionally built below street grade to reduce noise pollution for the surrounding neighborhoods.
Which is great for noise, but terrible for drainage.
Exactly. Because it's basically a massive concrete trench, it relies on a complex series of heavy-duty pumps to constantly eject rainwater.
And then a freak storm parked over the city.
Dropped 7 inches of rain, and the pumps were instantly outmatched. The highway literally filled up to the overpasses like a sluggish brown canal, trapping drivers in their cars.
And going back to the USGS data in Missouri, they documented this exact phenomenon with the Brush Creek floods in Kansas City.
Oh, right.
Yeah, in 1977 and then again in 1998, the rainfall was so intense and the basin response was so rapid that the flood peaks entirely shattered the predictive models.
How bad was it?
The flow actually exceeded the 0.2% annual exceedance probability.
Which, for anyone who doesn't speak hydrology, basically means they blew past the 500-year flood mark.
Yes.
The 500-year flood is an event so massive it supposedly only has a 1 in 500 chance of happening in any given year, and Kansas City surpassed that impossible threshold twice in a span of 20 years on the exact same creek.
It just proves that the conquest of nature was an illusion. When you vacuum seal a floodplain in concrete, and the climate ramps up the intensity of the rain, the surface of our cities transforms into a highly efficient, paved slip and slide that funnels water directly into our basements and subways.
So we've essentially built a waterproof seal over the earth that traps the water on the surface, moving it at terrifying speeds.
That's the surface crisis.
But what about all that standing water combined with the millions of tons of concrete trapping it? What is all that weight doing to the dirt beneath it?
Now we get to the really scary part.
Right, because that leads us to the second, much less visible half of this disaster. Let's talk about the subsurface crisis. Sinking cities.
Yes, this is a phenomenon known as land subsidence, and it is without a doubt one of the most critical, under-discussed aspects of the global flooding crisis.
We're so focused on the rain.
Exactly. We are so focused on the water rising, we are completely ignoring the fact that we are actively sinking our own cities.
I was looking at the mechanics of this, and the physics are surprisingly straightforward, but the consequences are just massive. Walk us through exactly how a major metropolitan city physically sinks into the earth.
Gladly. To understand subsidence, you have to look beneath the bedrock. Beneath many of the world's largest cities are massive aquifers.
But it's important to clarify what an aquifer actually is, right?
Yes, absolutely. It is
Yeah.
not a giant, cavernous underground lake.
Like an underground swimming pool.
Right, that's what people picture, but it's much more like a massive subterranean layer cake of Earth. It's bands of sand, gravel, silt, and clay that are completely saturated with groundwater.
So the water is actually occupying the microscopic physical space between the individual grains of dirt and clay.
Exactly. And because water is largely incompressible, it has structural integrity.
It pushes back.
Right. The hydrostatic pressure of that water pushes outward, helping to hold the microscopic structure of the Earth open, actively supporting the immense weight of the soil and the city above it.
But as these cities explode in population, they require massive amounts of fresh water.
So the city, or sometimes just private industries and citizens, drills thousands of deep wells and starts pumping that groundwater out on an industrial scale.
And that is where the crisis begins.
Yeah. When you pump that water out faster than nature can replenish it by rain trickling down, the water pressure inside the aquifer drops.
And the microscopic spaces between the grains of dirt that were previously held open by the water are suddenly empty.
And because the layers of clay and silt above it are incredibly heavy, those microscopic spaces begin to collapse. The layers permanently compact.
Wait, I want to clarify that word permanently because I think that is the scariest part of this whole concept. We aren't talking about squeezing a kitchen sponge where it springs back when you let go.
No, not at all.
It's more like stacking heavy encyclopedias on top of an empty cardboard box.
That is the perfect structural metaphor.
Once the box crushes under the weight, you can't just blow air back into it to make it a structurally sound box again. The internal structure is destroyed.
Exactly right. In hydrogeology, they call it inelastic compaction. When the clay and silt layers crush, they lose their porosity forever. The ground physically condenses and sinks.
And it takes everything on the surface down with it.
Everything. The highways, the skyscraper foundations, the sewer pipes, and crucially, the flood defenses. They all sink.
This brings us to the global satellite data from the United Nations University, UNUINWH. The scope of their research is genuinely terrifying.
It really is.
They analyze hundreds of thousands of satellite data points to measure microscopic, millimeter by millimeter changes in ground elevation all over the globe.
And the projections show that by the year 2040, 19% of the entire global population will be living in areas threatened by land subsidence.
19%. That represents roughly 1.6 billion human beings whose homes are literally sinking beneath them.
And what the data reveals is a massive geographic disparity.
Ah,
Over 86% of that exposed population is located in Asia.
wow.
The UN researchers identify these massive high-velocity subsidence zones, particularly in places like the Indo-Gangetic Plain and the sprawling Asian river deltas.
And the rate at which it is happening is the part that really broke my brain. In these hotspots, the land is sinking up to 20 times faster than the global sea level is rising.
20 times.
We spend billions of dollars mitigating climate-driven sea level rise, and we absolutely should, but the ground is plummeting down to meet the ocean at a wildly accelerated, human-engineered rate.
It completely alters the risk calculus. I mean, the chief scientist on that UN study pointed out that vertical land motion, this subsidence, is the glaring missing piece in most of our climate models.
Because we only look up.
Exactly. We are planning for a slow rise in the ocean, but we are completely ignoring the fact that the floor is dropping out from under us today.
And when you look at the real-world case studies, it is just heartbreaking. Look at Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia.
Yes, Jakarta is the prime example.
It's a megacity built on incredibly swampy delta ground right on the ocean, and it is sinking at an average rate of 1 to 15 centimeters every single year.
It's incredible.
In the northern parts of the city, North Jakarta, the ground is dropping by up to 25 centimeters, that's almost 10 inches, every single year.
The situation in Jakarta is a tragic example of structural failure forcing the hands of the citizens. The government knows the pumping is sinking the city, but a massive amount of the groundwater extraction is entirely illegal and unregulated.
But why? Why are they doing it if they know it's sinking them?
Well, the authorities are largely paralyzed to stop it because the municipal water infrastructure is so degraded and polluted that it fails to provide adequate, drinkable piped water to millions of its own residents.
So the people have literally no alternative.
Exactly. If you want to bathe your kids or run your small business, you have to sink a pipe into the ground and pump the water yourself, knowing full well that you are actively sinking your own neighborhood.
It is a desperate survival mechanism.
It is. And, it is vital to point out that this is not just a coastal issue. You don't have to be on the ocean to sink. Look at Mexico City.
Right. Mexico City is way inland.
It's inland, and it sits at an elevation of over 7,000 feet.
But the historical geography detailed in the research perfectly explains their current nightmare.
It goes all the way back to the Aztecs.
Yeah, Mexico City was originally Tenochtitlan, built by the Aztecs in the 1300s on an island in the middle of a massive shallow lake directly over a highly porous, clay-rich aquifer.
Right. And then the Spanish arrive, conquer the city, and decide they don't like living on a lake.
So they systematically drain it.
They drain it and build a sprawling European-style city right on top of the squishy, exposed lake bed. Fast forward to the 1850s, and they had already drilled over 140 deep artesian wells.
And today, you have a sprawling metropolis of 21 million people. And because they don't have a major river nearby, they are constantly sucking millions of gallons of water from the clay beneath their feet.
And the result of that extraction is catastrophic. Mexico City is sinking at an astonishing localized rate of 15 to 46 centimeters per year.
That's insane.
You are talking about 1.5 feet of ground subsidence annually in some districts. You can walk through the historic center and physically see centuries-old cathedrals tilting at severe angles, roads buckling, and massive structural fractures in the subway lines.
And there is one more factor that I found buried in the Wikipedia research that just adds insult to injury.
Oh, the weight of the cities themselves.
Yes. It's not just the removal of the water causing the compaction, it's the sheer physical mass of the city itself.
Yeah.
Cities like New York, Lagos in Nigeria, and San Francisco are experiencing localized subsidence simply because the astronomical weight of millions of tons of concrete, steel, and glass is physically pushing down on the soil.
It's squeezing the remaining water out and compressing the dirt.
When you zoom out and synthesize all of this, the paving of the surface and the draining of the subsurface, you can clearly see a vicious, positive feedback loop forming.
It's a textbook feedback loop.
Yeah.
Urbanization brings millions of people to a city. Those people require fresh water, so the city pumps more groundwater.
The aquifer permanently compacts.
And the land sinks. As the land sinks, the city loses its natural elevation and becomes exponentially more vulnerable to flooding.
And when that flood inevitably hits, what does the water do? It destroys the surface water treatment plants, it pollutes the local rivers with sewage, and it ruins the surface infrastructure.
So the city has less access to clean surface water.
Exactly. And because the surface water is ruined, the population is forced to rely even more heavily on pumping the deep groundwater to survive, which just accelerates the compaction, sinking the city further and guaranteeing the next flood will be even worse.
It is a completely self-destructive, closed-loop system.
Which naturally begs a massive, glaring question. If the surface is paved so the water can't drain and the ground below is literally caving in, who, in their right mind, keeps approving new subdivisions and corporate parks in these hazard zones?
It's a very good question.
Surely the government planners and the developers have access to this same hydrology data. Why do they keep building in the bowl?
Well, that brings us to our fourth critical area of analysis, and perhaps the most frustrating piece of the entire puzzle: government policy.
Oh boy, here we go.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, to understand why we keep building in the splash zone, we have to examine a concept called the safe development paradox.
This comes from a really brilliant policy paper by Raymond Burby analyzing government disaster policy in the wake of Hurricane Katrina.
Yes, the safe development paradox.
Okay, what exactly is the mechanism here? Define this paradox for us.
The safe development paradox posits a deeply counterintuitive reality. Government efforts designed specifically to make inherently hazardous areas safe for human development actually end up making those exact areas exponentially more susceptible to catastrophic, civilization-altering disasters.
So, by trying to engineer safety, they are mathematically guaranteeing a much worse disaster down the line. How does that actually work in practice?
It works by altering human behavior through a false sense of security. Let's say you have a sprawling natural floodplain. It floods a couple of feet every spring. Because it floods frequently, people know it's dangerous.
The risk is highly visible. Nature is providing constant low-level warning signs.
Exactly. So people build their houses on stilts, or they just choose to farm it and live on higher ground. But then the government steps in.
To fix the problem.
Right. They build a massive levee, a dam upstream, and a seawall. Suddenly the spring floods stop. The government successfully mitigates the frequent low-level risk. Because the hazard is now invisible, hidden behind a concrete wall, the public perception changes. People feel entirely safe.
And developers realize they can buy this formerly cheap, wet land and throw up 1,000 tract homes. Property values skyrocket, and you get massive population density in what is still geographically a low-lying basin.
Precisely. You've essentially set a trap. Because levees and dams are engineered structures, they have a maximum design capacity. Eventually, nature will produce an extreme weather event that exceeds that capacity.
And when the levee inevitably breaches, you don't just have a flooded soybean field anymore.
No, you have a catastrophe involving hundreds of thousands of trapped citizens and billions of dollars in destroyed infrastructure.
And the paper uses New Orleans as the ultimate tragic case study for this paradox. Let's wind the clock back to 1965. Hurricane Betsy slams into Louisiana.
It was America's first billion-dollar hurricane.
Right. It causes massive devastation and violently exposed how vulnerable these low-lying parishes around New Orleans really were. So in response, the federal government steps in. The Army Corps of Engineers proposes this massive infrastructure project, the Lake Pontchartrain and Vicinity Hurricane Protection Project.
They're going to build incredible new levees to save the city, which, is a completely understandable, politically popular, and well-intentioned reaction.
Totally.
The primary goal was supposed to be protecting the hundreds of thousands of citizens who were already living in harm's way.
But that wasn't the actual financial justification for the project.
This is the part that gets me.
This is the statistic from Burby's paper that absolutely floored me. When the government ran the cost-benefit analysis to justify spending all those taxpayer dollars on the levees, protecting the existing development and the people already living there only accounted for 21% of the calculated economic benefits.
That's 21%.
A staggering 79% of the economic justification for building the levees was based on the projection that the new walls would allow for massive new development on 9,600 acres of what was currently raw, uninhabitable wetlands.
It completely flips the narrative. The federal government wasn't just building a shield to protect a vulnerable population. They were actively weaponizing infrastructure to pave the way for massive, lucrative urban expansion directly into a sinking swamp.
Exactly. And it worked perfectly from a developer's perspective. The construction of those levees spurred explosive, aggressive development in areas like New Orleans East, Planning District 9, and the lands surrounding the NASA Mushoed facility.
Hundreds of thousands of working-class people moved into neighborhoods built on former swamps.
And those swamps were actively undergoing the exact subsidence we just talked about. They were sinking.
But everyone moved there because the presence of the federal levee acted as a giant green light. It signaled, the government says it's safe now.
And it wasn't just the physical presence of the levees encouraging this migration into the hazard zone. It was also the bureaucratic structure of the National Flood Insurance Program, or the NFIP.
Oh yes, the NFIP. The program mandates that if you are going to build a new structure in a designated flood zone, it has to be elevated to a specific height. But the foundational metric they use to determine that height is deeply mathematically flawed.
Because they base their regulations on the 100-year flood event. Let's talk about that standard because it sounds so authoritative.
It really does.
Yeah.
It means they are planning for a flood magnitude that only has a 1% probability of occurring in any single year.
It sounds like a rigorous benchmark to a layperson or a local city council member.
But the historical meteorological data tells a completely different story. The paper highlights that 83% of all hurricane-related wind and flood economic losses in the United States actually result from Category 3, 4, and 5 storms.
Wow.
These are extreme, catastrophic events that generate storm surges and rainfall that wildly exceed the 100-year flood standard.
It's an insane regulatory mismatch. Basing our entire national flood insurance strategy on the 100-year storm is like, I don't know, a massive global bank stress testing its security by only planning for a guy walking in with a crowbar while completely ignoring all statistical data on coordinated catastrophic cyber attacks.
That is a highly accurate analogy.
We are insuring and engineering for the wrong century of threats.
Exactly. We are stringently regulating for the moderate, manageable disaster, while practically inviting the catastrophic one. And you can see the real-world fallout of this flawed metric in the paper. They looked at Tropical Storm Allison.
In 2001.
Yes, which stalled over Houston. That storm flooded approximately 45,000 buildings.
But here's the kicker. Out of those 45,000 devastated buildings, only 7,000 of them were technically located within the government's official 100-year floodplain.
The vast majority of the people who lost their homes had been told by the official maps that they were in a safe zone.
The standard completely missed the reality of the hydrological risk.
So you have this incredibly dangerous cocktail. You have federal engineering projects providing a false physical shield and federal insurance policies providing a false financial shield, both of which are relying on outdated or structurally inadequate metrics.
Which naturally forces us to ask,
Yeah.
if the federal metrics are that fundamentally broken and federal levies are just encouraging developers to build in swamps, where is the local government?
That's the logical next question.
Right. It's the local mayor, the city council, and the local tax-paying citizens who suffer the absolute most when a city goes underwater. Why don't the local authorities just step up, zone the floodplains as protected wetlands, and pass laws to stop the building?
That introduces the second, equally frustrating paradox from Burby's research, the local government paradox.
All right, lay this one out for us.
The local government paradox explains that while local citizens and municipalities bear the absolute brunt of human suffering, infrastructure collapse, and financial ruin in the wake of a disaster, local elected officials systematically and predictably pay insufficient attention to policies that would actually limit that vulnerability.
But why? Is it just incompetence? Do they just not care that their city might drown in 20 years?
It is rarely malicious or a lack of caring.
Hmm.
It is a profound structural misalignment of political and economic incentives. Think about the immediate pressures on a local city council or a mayor.
They have to balance an annual budget.
They need massive amounts of tax revenue to run the public schools, patch the potholes, and pay the police and fire departments. They also face constant pressure to provide affordable housing to accommodate a growing population.
Right, and greenlighting a massive new 500-home subdivision on a cheap floodplain solves all of those immediate problems. It brings in construction jobs, it expands the property tax base, and it provides housing.
The economic gains are immediate and highly visible to the voters. Now compare that to hazard mitigation. Imagine a mayor telling a powerful development firm that they cannot build that lucrative subdivision because in 30 years, that land might flood.
Hazard mitigation brings invisible long-term benefits.
The benefit is simply that a disaster doesn't happen decades from now, but the political and economic pain of denying that development is immediate.
You lose the massive tax base today, the construction unions get angry at you, and the development firm takes all their money and funds your opponent in the next local election.
Precisely. The costs of responsible mitigation are paid entirely in the present, while the benefits might not occur until long after the current elected officials have retired.
So faced with that incentive structure, local governments frequently turn a blind eye to the long-term hazard, approve the permits, and quietly rely on the assumption that if things ever go catastrophically wrong, the federal government will swoop in with emergency relief funds to bail them out.
The B.O.O.G paper actually highlighted a legal battle from the 1980s that perfectly encapsulates this tension. It was wild.
Oh, the subrogation suit.
Yes. The Federal Insurance Administration, the FIA, which runs the flood insurance program, actually got so fed up with local negligence that they launched a $100 million subrogation suit against 3 local parishes in Louisiana: Jefferson, Orleans, and St. Bernard.
And just to clarify for our listeners, a subrogation suit in the insurance world is essentially when an insurance provider pays out claims to its clients, but then turns around and sues a third party who they believe actually caused the damages in order to recoup their money.
Right. The federal government was paying out massive claims to flooded homeowners, and the FIA sued these local Louisiana governments because they argued that the local officials were systematically failing to maintain their own local levees properly.
And they were purposefully failing to enforce basic building codes and elevation requirements for new construction.
Exactly. The local government was so lax in order to encourage development that they triggered massive federal payouts when the inevitable flood hit.
And the crazy part is, the courts actually ruled in the FIA's favor. They legally forced the parishes to improve their maintenance and code enforcement.
It is the ultimate illustration of the conflict. Local governments are incentivized to aggressively reap the short-term financial rewards of dangerous development while effectively pushing the massive long-term financial risk of that development onto the federal taxpayer.
So we've talked about the federal planners and the local mayors. Let's bring this down to the individual level. What does this broken system actually mean for the average homeowner? If you live in one of these vulnerable zones, how does this web of bad policy impact your personal choices about protecting your own family and property?
This is where we run into a foundational concept in economics called moral hazard.
Okay, moral hazard.
It describes a behavioral shift where being insured or protected actually incentivizes you to take significantly greater, more reckless risks, precisely because you know you are insulated from the negative consequences.
The classic example is someone who drives a lot more aggressively on the highway simply because they know they have a phenomenal zero-deductible car insurance policy. The safety net encourages the risk.
Exactly. And the structure of the National Flood Insurance Program is practically a textbook case study in generating moral hazard. The NFIP offers heavily subsidized insurance policies to people living in known hazard zones.
Right. The premiums that homeowners pay into the program do not come close to accurately reflecting the true astronomical statistical risk of living in those areas.
Because the federal government intentionally charges too little in order to keep the insurance affordable, the program operates at a massive systemic deficit.
And they constantly have to borrow billions of dollars from the U.S. Treasury just to pay out claims after major hurricanes. And I want to pause here for our listeners to note that we are examining the NFIP purely through the objective lens of structural economics and human behavioral incentives. We aren't taking a partisan stance on government spending here.
Of course not. It's just the structural economics of the situation. But the raw data shows that the behavioral outcome of this economic setup is staggering.
Right. Because homeowners know they have access to federally subsidized insurance, and because they logically expect federal disaster relief agencies to bail them out with grants if things get truly catastrophic, there is almost zero financial incentive for them to proactively spend their own money to protect their home.
The statistics strongly bear that out. Studies referenced in the research show that less than 15% of property owners living in designated flood hazard zones take any independent, preventative action to flood-proof their own properties.
Less than 15%.
They don't spend the money to elevate their critical utilities, they don't install proper water-resistant grading around their foundations, and they don't retrofit their ground floors. They logically rely on the subsidized system to make them whole after the fact.
It paints an incredibly bleak picture. You have geology working against you, engineering that is outmatched by the climate, local mayors addicted to tax revenue, and homeowners incentivized to do nothing.
It's a lot to take in.
Is there any mechanism, any policy lever that can force this system to actually work and protect people at the local level?
There is, and Burby's paper provides a really compelling, data-driven glimmer of hope.
Oh, good. We need some hope.
The key lies in something called state mandates. The researchers conducted a comparative analysis of NFIP insurance claims across different coastal states over a 25-year period. And the contrast in outcomes based on state-level policy is like night and day.
Give me the numbers on this because this blew my mind.
Okay, let's look at the control group first. States that had absolutely no comprehensive local planning mandates and no strict state-level building code enforcement mandates, states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, suffered massive disproportionate losses.
So what did the data look like for Louisiana?
In Louisiana, over that 25-year period, there were 55 NFIP flood claims for every 1,000 coastal residents. And the economic payouts averaged out to about $530 per capita.
Okay, so a high frequency of claims and $530 per capita in damage.
Now, conversely, let's look at a state like Florida. Florida took a different legislative path. The state government mandated strict statewide building code enforcement and forced every local municipality to engage in comprehensive hazard planning.
The state essentially took the decision-making power away from the locally incentivized mayors.
Exactly. Over that exact same 25-year period, facing similar hurricane threats, Florida had only one claim per 1,000 coastal residents, and their economic losses were only $71 per capita.
That is just an incredible disparity. 55 claims versus one claim, $530 in damages versus $71.
It is hard empirical proof that when a higher authority steps in and forces local governments to plan responsibly, map the hazards accurately, and rigorously enforce building codes, you can drastically reduce the human suffering and financial destruction.
Even in a state that acts as a magnet for massive hurricanes.
It proves that while we absolutely cannot control the weather or the rainfall intensity, we have near total control over our vulnerability to it. Vulnerability is a choice.
Okay, so let's take a major step back and look at the entire board we've laid out today. We understand the historical geology. We intentionally built our civilization in the bowl to get the fertile dirt.
We understand the hydrology and the engineering. We paved over the natural sponge, broke the climate models, and we are actively sinking the land by pumping the aquifers dry.
And we understand the broken policies. Our laws actively encourage developers to build in the splash zone. Knowing all of that, how do we actually survive the next 50 years? It seems like humanity only has two distinct choices moving forward. We either fight nature tooth and nail, or we get out of its way.
You have neatly summarized the two primary strategic paths that global planners are debating right now. Adaptation and managed retreat. Let's examine adaptation first.
Okay.
Adaptation is the strategy of fighting nature. It involves using immense innovative engineering and strict regulatory policy to hold the water back, manage the surface runoff, and stop the subsurface sinking.
When I think of ultimate adaptation, the first thing that comes to mind is the Thames Barrier in London.
Oh, a phenomenal piece of engineering.
We aren't talking about a dirt levee. We are talking about a series of massive, futuristic steel gates spanning the width of the River Thames.
These gates are 5 stories high.
When a North Sea storm surge threatens the city, they rotate these massive barriers up from the riverbed, effectively sealing off the river and protecting 1 million people from drowning. It is an awe-inspiring piece of defensive engineering.
It is a marvel, but true adaptation isn't just about building massive, expensive walls against the ocean. It's also about managing the invisible subsurface crisis we discussed earlier, the subsidence.
The sinking aquifers.
Exactly. And if you look to Asia, they have provided some incredibly effective blueprints for how to stabilize a sinking city through sheer regulatory will. Look at Tokyo.
Right, Tokyo was in a massive crisis in the mid-20th century, weren't they?
They were sinking rapidly. The post-war industrial boom required massive amounts of groundwater. But in the 1960s and 1970s, the Japanese government stepped in with draconian regulations. They strictly regulated, and in many industrial zones outright banned, the pumping of groundwater.
But how did they actually enforce that without instantly bankrupting their entire manufacturing sector? You can't just tell a factory they have no water tomorrow.
That is the key to their success. The government didn't just ban the pumping. They heavily subsidized and built alternative surface water infrastructure. They provided the factories with a viable, piped alternative from surface reservoirs and simultaneously taxed groundwater extraction to make it economically unfeasible.
And it worked brilliantly.
It did. By the late 1970s, Tokyo had effectively halted its land subsidence entirely. They proved you can stop the sinking if you have the political will to restructure your water economy.
And Shanghai took that subsurface engineering even a step further with something called active recharge, right?
Yes, Shanghai utilizes a highly aggressive strategy. They don't just legally limit the pumping of groundwater. They actively pumped an equal, massive volume of surface water back into the subterranean aquifer to artificially replace what the industries extract.
The goal is to maintain the hydrostatic pressure in the earth and physically hold the city up.
Exactly.
Okay, I have to push back on this because earlier we established the cardboard box metaphor.
Right.
We said that when the clay and silt layers of an aquifer collapse, the compaction is inelastic. It is permanently crushed. So if the microscopic structure is destroyed, how is Shanghai pumping millions of gallons of water back underground without the water just hitting a wall of crushed clay and blowing the asphalt streets upward in a massive geyser? Where is the water actually going?
That is a phenomenal question, and it gets to the extreme technical difficulty of active recharge. You are completely correct that they cannot reinflate the crushed clay layers. Those are gone.
So what are they reinflating?
Aquifers are stratified. They are layer cakes. They are composed of layers of clay, but also deep layers of coarse sand and gravel. Sand and gravel do not compact inelastically the way clay does.
So the sand acts like a rigid, porous framework.
Exactly. Shanghai is specifically targeting the deep, confined sand and gravel aquifers for their recharge efforts. They are using massive, high-pressure injection wells to force water into the sand layers.
By pressurizing the sand, they increase the overall structural integrity of the entire geological column.
Which drastically slows down the compaction of the surrounding clay. It requires intense, constant geological monitoring, hundreds of injection wells, and massive energy expenditure, but it is highly effective at stabilizing the city's elevation.
It is an incredible technological achievement, but adaptation clearly has its limits. As the popular science analysis pointed out, we are rapidly hitting economic and physical barriers where it just doesn't make logical sense to keep trying to bend nature to our will.
You cannot afford to put a 5-story steel gate around every single coastal city in the world.
And you can't active recharge every sinking delta. Which brings us to the more radical and frankly more painful second option, managed retreat.
Managed retreat is a concept that is gaining huge, serious traction among climate policy experts and urban planners. It is the coordinated, legally planned, and financially supported withdrawal of human settlement from highly risky areas.
Instead of battling Mother Nature with endless concrete and inevitably losing, we surrender the ground, we demolish the infrastructure, pull the people out, and give the land back to the river or the ocean.
It feels like an admission of defeat, but it's happening on a microscale already. The research highlighted Harris County in Texas, around Houston.
Oh, right.
After repeated devastating floods, the local government realized they couldn't engineer their way out, so they instituted a massive buyout program. They're actively identifying the most flood-prone repetitive loss neighborhoods, offering the homeowners fair market value to pack up and move to higher ground.
And then completely demolishing the old subdivisions to let the land return to natural wetland. They are intentionally creating natural, unpaved flood buffers.
It is highly effective on a neighborhood level. But the most staggering, unprecedented example of managed retreat in human history is happening right now on a macro scale in Indonesia.
Yes, I read the Earth.org breakdown of this, and this story is just wild. We talked earlier about Jakarta sinking up to 10 inches a year.
Yes?
Between the aggressive subsidence, the rising sea levels, the suffocating traffic congestion, and the polluted surface water, the city has become so existentially threatened that the Indonesian government is taking the ultimate step. They aren't just moving a neighborhood, they are packing up and relocating their entire national capital.
It is a monumental undertaking. They're moving the seat of the federal government from Jakarta, which is located on the highly populated island of Java, to a brand new, purpose-built smart city called Nusantara.
Located in the province of East Kalimantan on the entirely different island of Borneo.
It's the equivalent of the United States deciding Washington, D.C. is too swampy and just building a new capital in the mountains of Colorado from scratch.
But what's truly fascinating about the Indonesian retreat is that the motivations aren't just about escaping the floodwaters. It's also deeply strategically tied to national economics and wealth distribution.
Correct. The island of Java is massively overcrowded. Despite being just one island in a massive archipelago, it currently contributes roughly 58% of Indonesia's entire gross domestic product.
It is the overwhelming center of political power, wealth, and development.
Meanwhile, the massive island of Kalimantan contributes less than 9% to the national GDP. By physically moving the political and administrative center to Borneo, the government is explicitly trying to decouple the governmental hub from the economic hub.
They are hoping to forcefully redistribute wealth, infrastructure, and development to a historically neglected, remote region of the country.
But this grand vision raises a massive, incredibly dark question about the reality of climate adaptation. If you are building a futuristic, safe new capital on a different island, who exactly gets left behind in the sinking, drowning city?
This raises what is perhaps the most important ethical and socioeconomic question of the 21st century. The Indonesian relocation perfectly highlights the brutal, stark social inequality inherent in climate adaptation.
The master plans for the new capital in Borneo are designed to accommodate only about 1.5 million people, and those spots are primarily reserved for federal civil servants, military personnel, their families, and the wealthy elites and corporate executives who can afford the logistical cost of migrating to a new island.
Leaving roughly 8.5 million middle and lower class citizens, informal workers, and the urban poor utterly stuck in Jakarta.
Stuck in a megacity that is still actively sinking, still brutally congested, and increasingly vulnerable to catastrophic storm surges.
And what is the government's proposed adaptation solution for the millions left behind? A massive, highly controversial giant seawall project across the Bay of Jakarta.
It is a project that has been debated for over a decade, is astronomically expensive, and environmentalists warn it threatens to completely destroy the local artisanal fishing industry.
And decimate the surrounding coral reefs that the poorest citizens rely on for their livelihoods?
It is a tale of two cities. The elite get managed to retreat to a smart city, and the working class get a concrete wall and a prayer.
And even for the people moving to the new capital in Borneo, the environmental cost is genuinely terrifying. Borneo isn't just an empty lot waiting for a city.
No, it is home to some of the most pristine, ancient, and ecologically vital tropical rainforests on planet Earth.
It is one of the last major natural habitats for endangered species like the orangutan.
Ecologists frequently refer to the rainforests of Borneo as the lungs of the world, functioning much like the Amazon. Those ancient forests absorb massive amounts of global carbon dioxide.
Environmental watchdog groups are incredibly concerned that injecting a massive, sprawling new capital city into this fragile ecosystem, bringing with it millions of immigrants, new highway networks, massive concrete production, and inevitable illegal mining and logging, will absolutely devastate the biodiversity.
There is a very real, mathematically supported fear that developing Borneo could physically flip it from being a massive carbon sink into a massive net emitter of greenhouse gases.
Which would further accelerate the exact global climate crisis that they are trying to run away from in the first place. It is the ultimate tragic irony. You try to escape a localized climate disaster by initiating development that potentially triggers a worse global one.
It perfectly encapsulates the incredible, almost paralyzing complexity of the climate challenge we face. There are no easy, victimless answers anymore. There are only incredibly difficult trade-offs where solving one crisis inevitably exacerbates another.
Which brings this entire conversation right back to you, the listener. We have covered a massive amount of conceptual ground today. We journeyed from the ancient, nutrient-rich silt of the Yellow River through the complex hydrological regression equations of Missouri, down into the collapsing aquifers of Mexico City, and through the halls of Congress looking at flood insurance.
It's a lot of dense structural information.
It is. But why does any of this matter to your everyday life? It matters because you interact with this collision course every single day. Whether you are browsing Zillow, trying to decide where to buy your next house, looking at the confusing fine print on a flood insurance policy, voting in a local election on a municipal bond measure to upgrade city drainage, or just sitting in traffic on a random Tuesday wondering why your commute is suddenly under 2 feet of water from a standard thunderstorm.
This deep dive really reveals the invisible mechanics governing your world.
Exactly. The ground beneath your feet is not a static backdrop. It is an active participant in a complex, incredibly fragile system. The concrete isn't an anchor. It is a highly consequential variable in an equation that is actively changing.
And I will leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've synthesized today. Think about the grand arc of human history. For 5,000 years, the fundamental story of human civilization has been defined by our relentless migration towards the water.
We actively sought out the rich, fertile, dynamic floodplains of the Tigris, the Nile, and the Thames to build our very first great cities.
We chased the rivers and we built our empires in the splash zone. But as the floodwaters rise, the concrete sinks into the clay, and the increasingly violent storms shatter our best engineering models, the next great era of human civilization may very well be defined by our desperate migration away from them.
We are currently watching the beginning stages of the reversal of a 5,000-year-old human settlement pattern playing out in real time on satellite data.
If managed retreat transitions from a radical idea into the global norm, and we are forced to slowly abandon the coasts and the great floodplains, where will the new dry centers of humanity take root?
Where will we build the next anchor? And will we be smart enough not to pave over the sponge when we get there? It's a fascinating, daunting question to leave you with. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive. We hope you walk away seeing the pavement outside your window and the rain falling on it just a little bit differently. Stay curious, stay informed, and we will catch you on the next one.